All right, good evening, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Where are my captions? Where are my captions at? Oh, yeah, that's right. I haven't added them to this screen yet. I only have them in my gameplay screen, so they don't do me any good. I will not do that while we're live. I'll do that later. Uh, so, we are still reading in Forbidden History. Um, we're actually, I think, going to be finishing up section 2 today. Let me check real quick. We're reading the 8th and ninth. Um, yes, we're reading the 8th and ninth articles. That takes us through the end of section 2, and we get through the gradualism versus um, catastrophism section, and then next time we'll pick up exploring the greater antiquity of civilization. But for now, we'll get into this. And if you're here and you have something to say in regard to these articles, please chime in chat. Um, any thoughts, whatever. Whether you believe it, you think it's bullshit, it gives you an idea for a role playing game or a novel you want to write, whatever. That's kind of what this is about in part. So please just chime in, or just listen if that's all you want to do. That's perfectly fine. So here we go. So this is Article 8. And again, I've said this every time, but I'm going to say it again. These are articles that appeared originally in Atlantis Rising magazine. And they were compiled by the editor, Douglas Kenyon. And so most of them are probably from like the 90s, late 90s. So keep that in mind. Some of them are a little bit dated in some of the stuff. They're talking about brand new things we've known about for 20 years, that sort of thing. So, all right, here we go. The perils of planetary amnesia. As evidence of ancient cataclysm mounts, the legacy of a rejected genius is reconsidered. By Steve Parsons. At one time, Immanuel Velikovsky was known and respected as a world-class scholar. After studying at Edinburgh, Moscow, Zurich, Berlin, and Vienna, Velikovsky earned a reputation as an accomplished psychoanalyst and enjoyed close ties to Albert Einstein and Freud's first pupil, Wilhelm Stekel. But with the 1950 publication by the Macmillan Company of his best-selling book, Worlds in Collision, Velikovsky's reputation in the halls of science plummeted all the way to the basement. His stature as a researcher and scholar would not recover for the rest of his life. Overnight, Velikovsky became persona non grata on college campuses across the nation, and his work was vilified by mainstream astronomers. How did the Russian-born Jewish scholar, educated at the world's most respected centers of learning, bring such a firestorm of criticism upon himself? What caused powerful men of science to denounce Velikovsky as a liar and charlatan on the basis of hearsay, swearing never to read his popular book? Why have respected professionals lost their jobs for committing the crime of recommending an open investigation of Velikovsky's conclusions? After examining the ancient records of cultures around the world, Velikovsky made 3 unusual claims in Worlds in Collision. Wow. I'll get into it. I promise. Um, he postulated that 1. The planet Venus moved on a highly irregular course, passing very close to Earth within human history. 2. Electromagnetic and electrostatic forces operate on a planetary scale, powerful enough to affect the motions and activity of planets. And 3. The planet Venus took the form of an immense comet in the ancient sky, inspiring great awe and fear in the hearts of our distant ancestors. Velikovsky's conclusions were controversial, But this alone cannot explain the intensity of the response from the halls of academia. Controversy alone cannot explain why, over many years, the popular Carl Sagan mounted a personal campaign to discredit Velikovsky. Normally, the marketplace of ideas will accommodate a broad range in thought from the weird to the boring, but not this time. And not anymore. Just commentary on what's going on in the world right now. Um, the sheer novelty, where the hell did I get that? The sheer novelty of Velikovsky's work cannot explain why Dr. Harlow Shapley, director of the Harvard Observatory, along with the ranking astronomer Fred Whipple and other powerful scientists, would force Macmillan to cease publication and fire its own editor, James Putnam, even though Worlds in Collision had soared to the top of the bestseller lists. Some have speculated that only the power of truth touching the raw nerve of mass denial could cause grown men to go ballistic like this. Seems like my lighting's off, but both bulbs are still burning. So anyway, seems a little darker in here tonight than usual. Only a deeply buried trauma in the mass consciousness could erupt with such irrational fury. In the case of the Velikovsky affair, the organized, frantic defense of entrenched belief produced one of the most pathological episodes in the history of science. Had Immanuel Velikovsky penetrated the veil of planetary amnesia? As a psychoanalyst, Velikovsky was well qualified to recognize pathology in human behavior. In a later book, Mankind in Amnesia, he claims that the ancient sages exhibited a frightened state of mind, haunted by a particular fear based on terrible events their ancestors had experienced when the world was ripped apart by monstrous natural forces. He describes the means by which this deepest of collective traumas was gradually buried and forgotten over the years, but not eliminated. Aristotle's cosmology, which dominated scholastic thinking for 2,000 years, acted with surprising precision to suppress all lingering fears of planetary disorder. Then, in the 1800s, modern science agreed that the solar system, Earth, and all forms of life on Earth had absolutely never passed through any kind of wild or disorderly phase in the past. This idea, known as uniformitarianism, became established dogma in science. The tide of human thought has successfully driven the memory from conscious awareness, but the evidence indicates it is still alive in the collective human psyche. Velikovsky understood our tendency to suppress trauma, but also to express and repeat trauma in peculiar ways. For example, the early wars of conquest were deliberately conducted as a ritual exercise to reenact the havoc and destruction brought by the planetary gods of old. In today's world, we barely recognize our own violence and certainly don't associate it with ancient roots. That's the nature of buried trauma. One doesn't see one's own shadow. Immanuel Velikovsky initially believed that the checks and balances of science would encourage others to examine his conclusions and perform their own investigation along the same lines. Unfortunately, however, by the time he passed away in 1979, he had come to believe that his ideas would never be taken seriously by mainstream science. Though the early 70s saw a renewal of public interest in Velikovsky's work, the doors of science have remained tightly shut on it to this day. Only the most highly motivated individuals with independent financial support have been able to continue the research where Velikovsky left off. Interestingly, recent findings by the space program have confirmed much of what Velikovsky said. Consider the following Venusian puzzles. Venus spins in a direction opposite that of the other planets, and its temperature of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit is much hotter than expected for an object in its orbital position. The chemistry of Venus violates the established theory of planet formation. The upper atmosphere of Venus is marked by extreme, faster than rotation winds, and the calm lower atmosphere displays continuous lightning discharges. The body of the planet is covered with 100,000 volcanoes that have completely resurfaced the planet in recent geological time. And finally, the traditional theory cannot account for the invisible remnant of a comet-like tail extending 45 million kilometers into space. The Venusian tail was detected by the Earth-orbiting SOHO satellite and reported in the June 1997 issue of New Scientist. The Venusian puzzles make sense, it can be argued, if we believe that ancient people actually said what ancient people actually said about Venus. They said that Venus was a comet. They called Venus the long-haired star, the bearded star, and the witch star. They said Venus took the form of the goddess in both her beautiful aspect and her terrible aspect, that she was a fierce dragon who attacked the world, a newly arriving body that has not yet achieved thermal and electrical equilibrium with its environment could present such a display in the sky. Apparently, Velikovsky's opened the door to our buried collective memories by regarding the testimony of ancient people as credible evidence for unusual natural events in our past. So, just to pause for a second, because I want to write something down for my own purposes, that is an interesting thing I've never heard of, the bearded star, the witch star. I had never heard that about Venus before. Sorry, I'm just trying to write a note real quick for my own research later. And I forgot a word there for a second. Okay, so save it so it doesn't get lost. All right. Yeah, very interesting. Apparently, Velikovsky opened the door to our buried collective memories by regarding testimony of ancient people as credible evidence for unusual natural events in our past. His journey began when he studied the Egyptian and Hebrew accounts of the disasters and wonders that accompanied the Old Testament Exodus. Dated at approximately 1500 BCE, he discovered close parallels in the historical writings of other cultures, suggesting that the same sequence of catastrophes beset the entire globe and was experienced by all people simultaneously. Now that's another interesting thought. What if the exact same events influenced the origin stories of multiple cultures simultaneously, including like stories of floods, stories of the origin, like Genesis and other very similar stories from other parts of the world. That's an interesting idea too. I want to do a little bit of digging on that. So sorry, I'm writing another note. Okay. Getting some ideas out of this article. So, where were we? His journey began when he studied the Egyptian and Hebrew accounts of the disasters and wonders that accompanied the Old Testament Exodus. I already read this part, but I'll continue. Dated approximately 1500 BCE, he discovered close parallels in the historical writings of other cultures, suggesting that the same sequence of catastrophes beset the entire globe and was experienced by all people simultaneously. In 1950, science was not yet ready to accept the testimony of ancient people as credible evidence for unusual planetary events. The physical sciences would not tolerate an intrusion by an outsider who drew conclusions that crossed academic boundaries. But nearly 50 years later, science has opened the door a crack. Two innovative theorists in the scientific establishment have recently, remember this is 20 plus years ago, recently published a book bearing a distinctive Velikovskian tone. Dr. Victor Klube, Dean of the Department of Astrophysics at Oxford, together with his colleague Dr. William Napier, has developed a thesis of cometary catastrophe that draws upon mythical themes as primary evidence. Though Klube and Napier's cometary visitor was not a planet, the story is surprisingly close to that of Worlds in Collision. Other innovative theorists have thrown themselves even more wholeheartedly into the line of research. The comparative mythologist David Talbot and the physicist Wallace Thornhill independently recognized the power of Velikovsky's discoveries and have followed up with 45 years of combined research of their own. So I wonder if they're talking about the younger Dryas. Is that what it's called? Dryas? Um, that these guys theorized. I'm not familiar with who came up with that theory. I've just been hearing about it a bit in my own research. Okay, opening the mind to the electric universe. By breaking from the pack and looking at observed facts with fresh eyes, Wallace Thornhill has become convinced that planets and stars function in an electrically dynamic environment. The Venusian tail, discovered last year, so you can see he mentioned the article was what, 1986 or something like that. Um, oh, oh no, 1997. 97. So this came out, or the article was in 98. So okay, there we go. That answers my own question. The Venusian tail, discovered last year, retains its rope-like or filamentary structure across 45 million kilometers because it is a current-carrying plasma. These plasma structures, Birkeland currents, are well known to plasma physicists, but remain unrecognized by astronomers. There you go. The very existence of Birkeland currents in the solar system demonstrates the existence of a flow of electric current in the plasma that fills the solar system, and this opens up a whole new way of seeing things. Thornhill says that stars do not produce all of their light and heat by thermonuclear processes. Instead, our sun and all other stars resemble great spheres of lightning. These spheres receive energy externally rather than from nuclear fusion at their core, he says. The accepted theory that stars produce energy by nuclear fusion suits the mindset of the atomic era but does not conform to actual observations. Sadly, the general public has no way of knowing that the behavior of our sun does not fit the conventional theory. We observe a lack of neutrinos, temperature reductions rather than gains, as one approaches the surface. Accelerated solar wind, strong rotation behavior, and holes in the surface that reveal a cooler rather than hotter interior. That's also very interesting, something I did not know. Quote, you have to observe what nature actually does, he says, not what you think it should do, end quote. Thornhill's empirical approach does allow ancient human testimony to count as credible evidence. Fables, legends, and myths don't prove Thornhill's idea, but they provide clues. For instance, the mythical gods hurled great thunderbolts at each other when they battled in the heavens. The flashing thunderbolt was their weapon of choice, and the earliest written records of the ancient sages and stargazers confirm that the gods who battled in the sky were named with the same names as our own most familiar planets. If, 1, the mythical gods were the planets, and if 2, the planets moved so close to each other in the sky that they exchanged colossal electrical bolts, and if 3, this took place within human memory, then where are the scars and the craters? Actually, the scars of colossal electric strikes literally cover the moon and most of the planets. These scars are fresh and abundant, just waiting to be studied from a new perspective. Specific patterns in these scars bear a remarkable similarity to the patterns left behind by natural lightning strikes and arcs produced in laboratories on Earth. Planetary geologists speculate that the long, tapering, sinuous rilles found on the moon and stars, which travel both uphill and downhill for hundreds of kilometers, are collapsed lava tubes or dry riverbeds or cracks in the crust. But conventional experts are grasping at straws on this one. The electrical signature is unmistakable. Such hard evidence is dangerous to science. What if Thornhill's claims are taken seriously? What if the glass collected from the bottom of small craters of the moon and brought back by the astronauts were really heated and melted by electrical discharge rather than meteor impact? What if the Valles Marineris was actually caused by a giant thunderbolt that ripped across the face of Mars, leaving a gaping chasm that could swallow 1,000 Grand Canyons? If thousands of marks and scars on the planets were caused by powerful electric discharges, the thunderbolts of the gods, then astronomy is left with more than egg on its face. We're talking about an omelet. Fortunately for Thornhill, he has not suffered persecution for his unusual views, at least not yet. Perhaps this is because the views of the unassuming Aussie have not received much exposure, but that will change soon. Unlocking amnesia through myth. David Talbot has already found himself the subject of a 90-minute documentary titled Remembering the End of the World. Unlike Thornhill's work in the physical sciences, Talbot's work rests upon unusual and unexpected patterns found in human memory. And what a memory! Imagine a global event of extreme drama experienced by the entire human race involving great wonders in the sky. Imagine the intensity of the experience and its memory to be so great as to alter the course of human development. For the first time ever, entire nations began to erect grand monuments to the gods and perform passionate rituals in a futile effort to relive the earlier experience, to magically restore life to the way it was before the Great Collapse. At the dawn of civilization, perhaps 5,000 years ago, says Talbot, every dimension of civilized life pointed to the earlier time when things were better, when heaven was close to earth, before the gods went away. The arts, the songs, the stories, the architecture, the religious beliefs, the military affairs, and the meaning of words and symbols all provide us with lasting evidence of what people experienced then. And according to Talbot, people used every device known to keep alive the memory of a glory that once was. That glory and its violent collapse involved catastrophic displays in the heavens as planets moved close to Earth and appeared huge in the sky. But just as the fabled gods had gone away, the memory of the golden time would eventually go away. The memory of the violent collapse of the golden time would also go away, but its scars would not. Those scars of massive collective trauma, of doomsday, dwell within every human being alive today and powerfully affect how we relate to the world and to each other. Velikovsky understood the way by which an individual suppresses the painful memory of trauma in the psyche. He reasoned that the entire human race has collectively suppressed the trauma of its expulsion from the womb-like golden time. Yet that suppressed trauma keeps expressing itself as human violence and alienation. We accept the background pain as a normal state of existence because that's what everyone has always felt, going back as far as anybody can remember. But Velikovsky would say that this state is not normal. We collectively suffer a distorted view of life because of this greatest of all traumas, when the time of perfect virtue, as the Chinese call it, came to a cold and bitter end. Just a side thought, I wonder if that idea is what could have formed parts of um, stories. I'll say stories, not to offend anybody if you're terribly hardcore Christian or anything, but stories like that in Genesis of being expelled from the Garden of Eden. And there are many other stories that parallel that. That some of them are a lot older than that one. I just wonder, just a thought, something to think about. Let's see. Talbot has extended Velikovsky's work by showing in exquisite detail the way that Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and Venus were intimately tied to human experience during primordial times. These planets traveled very close to Earth, actually assuming a stable and symmetrical collinear configuration immediately prior to the myth-making epoch. The Age of the Gods, according to Talbot's astonishing story, harkens both to the stable, peaceful period and to the violent, dramatic period when the collinear configuration destabilized and collapsed completely. Throughout the world, people have drawn images and symbols bearing a distinctive crescent. Lay people and experts alike always assume that the crescent represents the moon. Sometimes the crescent has been drawn with a star in the center, but think about it. No star will ever be seen within the crescent of the moon, as the body of the moon occupies that space. And no orb sits squarely in front of the moon that we can see today. Talbot could speak for hours on this symbol alone to show that we are confronting an image whose imprint is far deeper in human consciousness and far more awesome than our familiar moon. In fact, Talbot found no astronomical records of a moon prior to about 500 BCE, even though the people of early times were nearly obsessed with observing the activity in the sky. The crescent was cast by our sun on Saturn when Saturn occupied the pole position in the sky, so close as to be subtend. I've never seen that word. subtend. Subtend up to 20 degrees of arc or more. The small orb in the center was Venus in her dormant phase. Venus appeared as a shining star when in her radiant phase. Wallace Thornhill's understanding of plasma discharge phenomena allows even the non-technical mind to visualize the way a young Venus might have produced the radiating, luminous streamers found in ancient representations of the planet. Using research methods borrowed from Velikovsky, Talbot examined the mythology of every major culture in the world. Since mythical stories become more locally established with the passage of time, he traced the stories back to their oldest and purest forms. This led him to the earliest writings from the cradle of civilization in the Middle East and ancient Egypt. The Great Pyramids, according to Talbot, are filled with human writings that describe a word that we do not see today. A world, that we do not see today. A sky that we do not see today. That's why the meaning of the hieroglyphs bewilders our best experts. These inscriptions don't answer to our world. This is an important clue. What support from Thornhill and a growing number of established scholars, David Talbot is mounting a heresy even more radical than Velikovsky's. He claims with complete assurance that Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter traveled very close to Earth within human memory. He says that together these planets presented a stupendous form in the sky, at times peaceful and at times violent. The people alive during the Age of the Gods felt a deep kinship with these familiar forms. That's why the battle of the gods in the sky and the departure of the gods caused such confusion and trauma. The emotional climate for those people might have resembled that of innocent children whose reliable and loving parents suddenly turned into capricious tyrants before finally abandoning them. For the first time, people began to experience the illusion of separation and all forms of human violence. The rest is history. So there was something a little ways further back here. The pyramids. Yeah, the hieroglyphs in the pyramids. To the best of anybody's knowledge, currently now, and the best of my knowledge, there are no hieroglyphs in the Egyptian pyramids. At least not the ones at Giza. None they've found so far, anyway. Which is part of what the thinking of why they were never tombs. But anyway, shall we just jump straight into the next one? Unless anybody has anything to add or comment. Yay, nay. You don't have to. If not, I will jump into the 9th and last article in this section, and we'll finish out section 2. It's only like 6, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 8 pages. And so it'll take the rest of the hour at least, maybe a little bit more. All right, so Thunderbolts of the Gods. Does growing evidence of an electric universe reveal previously hidden meaning in ancient mythology? By Mel and Amy Atchison. Who would have guessed that the myths of ancient cultures could throw new light on the mysterious surface features of planets and moons, or give new meaning to current work in artificial lightning laboratories? If the mythologist David Talbot of Portland, Oregon, and the physicist Wallace Thornhill of Canberra, Australia, are correct, then ancient myths and symbols are a key to an expanded and holistic understanding of both history and the physical universe. I have a feeling we're going to be reading a lot of the same stuff in this article that we just went through, but we'll plow through it. Yet in our age, world mythology seems a most unlikely source of discovery. Until recently, mythologists sought to explain the ancient stories with references to events in everyday life, to the seasons, to the power of a storm, to phases of the moon, or to movements of the sun. But their efforts have produced a morass of contradictions. Is that morass? It's 2 S's, so... contradictions, reinforcing the popular belief that myth is fiction, pure and simple, anything but a dependable guide to the past. Comparative mythology. In contrast, David Talbot, inspired by Immanuel Velikovsky's theory of interplanetary upheaval, developed a method for comparing the myths of far-flung cultures. His objective was to discover whether reliable memories were embedded in the different stories. This method is similar to the reasoning of attorneys in a court of law, questioning witnesses who may be lying or incompetent or remembering incorrectly. When statements from independent witnesses converge on unique details, they tend to corroborate each other, even if the witnesses are not reliable in other things they say. Similarly, according to Talbot, there are hundreds of common themes in world mythology in which different words and different symbols point to the same remembered events. The more peculiar the points of convergence, the more unreasonable it is to dismiss them. When allowed to speak for themselves, these universal memories tell a coherent and detailed story, Talbot claims. But it is a story that seems preposterous from today's worldview. According to Talbot, what the ancients worshipped and feared as powerful gods were planets positioned extremely close to Earth. This close congregation of planets appeared as huge powers in the sky. Their instabilities and unpredictable movements gave rise to one of the most common themes of myth, the wars of the gods. In these dramatic stories, the gods pounded each other with cosmic lightning while fire and stone descended on Earth. The weapon of the gods. In ancient traditions, few images are more vividly presented than the thunderbolts of the planetary gods, Talbot notes. Consider the gas giant Jupiter, whom the Greeks remembered as the ruler Zeus, the victor in the celestial clash of the Titans. Quote, Jupiter is just a little speck of light in our sky, but ancient peoples recalled the god Jupiter as a towering form in the heavens, wielding lightning as his weapon of choice. What does this mean? If the gods were planets, then the thunderbolts of the gods were nothing less than interplanetary lightning discharges. End quote. In Hesiod's Theogony, we read of Zeus, quote, From heaven and from Olympus he came immediately, hurling his lightning. The bolts flew thick and fast from his strong hand, together with thunder and lightning, whirling an awesome flame. End quote. When the dragon Typhon attacked the world, there was thunder and lightning and fire from the monster and the scorching winds and blazing thunderbolt. Destroyed by a lightning bolt from Zeus, the world-threatening dragon came to be known as the, quote, thunder-stricken. Indeed, it is remarkable how many mythical figures are struck down by lightning. In classical myth alone, these figures include Enceladus, Mimas. If I get some of these names wrong, forgive me. Menoetius, Aristodemus, and Capanius. Some of these I've never seen before in my life. Edus, Iasion, and Asclepius. Wow. Quote, the biggest mistake a scholar can make, Talbot says, is to look for terrestrial explanations. The earliest form of these stories are cosmic. The gods, the great heroes, and the thunderbolts that fly between them are celestial through and through, end quote. Hebrew tradition has remembered all the lightning of the gods. Psalm 77 proclaims, quote, The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven, the lightnings lightened the world, the earth trembled and shook, end quote. From India, the Mahabharata, and the Ramayana relate that lightning of the gods filled the heavens like a rain of fiery arrows. From ancient Egypt, Babylon, Scandinavia, China, and the Americas, myths of the legends describe conflagrations attributed to thunderbolts from the gods. These stories of cosmic battles provide much of the content of the myths we know today. Talbot writes, quote, "If we failed to recognize the celestial players, it's because the planets which inspired these stories have receded to pinpoints of light. In modern times, we see no interplanetary lightning arcing between them." End quote. But Talbot reminds us that if there is anything to these global memories, the physical evidence should be massive. This amounts to a call for objective investigation of the surface features of planets and moons to see if the telltale markings of interplanetary discharges might be present. Electricity and astronomy. Unbeknownst to Talbot, the Australian physicist Wallace Thornhill had been pursuing just such an investigation. Thornhill had discovered Velikovsky's book shortly before starting his university career. Quote, "I was the only physics undergraduate to haunt the anthropology shelves of the university library," and he says. "The result was a strong conviction that Velikovsky had presented a case that required further study." End quote. But his next discovery was the reluctance, even hostility, of scientists to question the assumptions underlying their theories. One of those assumptions that Thornhill questioned was the insignificance of electrical phenomena on astronomical scales. The Nobel laureate Hans Alfvén, a pioneering investigator of the properties of plasma in electrical discharges such as lightning, had admonished theoretical physicists that their models were wrong. Real plasma didn't behave the way mathematical deductions predicted. They are not superconductors, Thornhill explains, nor can they be treated as a gas, as is implicit, for example, in the term solar wind. Electrical currents flow in them, pinching into long filaments and then braiding themselves into rope-like structures. These long, twisted filaments are visible in solar prominences, galactic jets, and comet tails. They were detected as stringy things in the 40 million kilometer long tail of Venus last year. Following the suggestion of Ralph Jurgens, an electrical engineer who studied Alfvén's work, Thornhill began to amass evidence showing that most features now being photographed on planets, satellites, and asteroids are scars of plasma discharges, interplanetary lightning. Quote, "By scaling up electrical effects seen on Earth and in the laboratory, I can provide stunning support for the ancient imagery of a different sky and hence the likelihood that planets and moons did move in close proximity in the recent past," he claims. An electrical model provides a simple mechanism for reordering a chaotic planetary system in a very short time and maintaining that stability. End quote. One of the laboratory effects is produced by moving the high-voltage pointed rod just above the surface of a powder-covered insulator placed on a grounded metal plate. The spark forms characteristic patterns in the powder. A long, narrow main channel of fairly uniform width will have a narrower, more sinuous channel engraved along its center. Tributary channels run parallel to the main channel for a distance, then they rejoin it almost perpendicularly. Thornhill points out that these same features are seen on a larger scale in lightning strikes to Earth, such as on golf courses. Trenches of constant width are created with narrow furrows snaking down their centers. The soil blasted from the trench is deposited along both sides. Secondary channels may run parallel to the main channel and tributary channels join at right angles. Planetary plasma effects. Thornhill describes how the same effects are repeated on a planetary scale in features called sinuous rilles. Long, uniformly narrow channels snake across the surface, often with levees of material deposited along each side. The more sinuous inner channels often have chains of small circular craters precisely centered along their axes, or the craters overlap to produce fluted walls. There is generally no sign of rubble from collapsed roofs, as would be expected if the conventional lava tube explanation for riles on the moon were correct. Nor is there evidence of the outwash that would result if the channels had been formed by water, as has been proposed for riles on Mars. There are a couple of pictures, but I don't think they would show up if I put them up to the camera. There's one. I think. There we go. Sorry. And then the other. I'm not used to trying to show stuff on camera. Okay, so the one down that I just showed says Hyginus Ryle on the moon. Neither water nor lava produces channels punctuated by circular pits, but this is a common feature of discharge channels, according to Wallace Thornhill. And then the first one I showed up here says the characteristic corkscrew form of a plasma filament arcing across the surface of Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter. So, back to the text. Furthermore, the riles run uphill and down. Thornhill points out, following an electrical potential rather than the gravitational potential, as water and lava do. These, where riles intersect, the younger channel and its levees continue uninterrupted across the older as though the older channel weren't there. This is especially obvious on Europa, where the levees are often darker than the surrounding terrain. They are also darker than the central channel, which creates a problem for the accepted explanation that they are darker material welling up through cracks in the ice. Thornhill surmises that the electrical forces of the arc altered the chemical or possibly the nuclear composition of the debris. Particularly remarkable is the series of looping riles on Europa. Ice cracking in loops is unheard of, but the characteristic corkscrew form of a plasma filament arcing across the surface easily explains it. Thornhill also notes the similarities of craters on the planets and moons to those created in the laboratory. Both tend to be perfectly circular because an electrical arc always strikes perpendicular to a surface. Walls are nearly vertical and floors are nearly flat as the circular motion of the arc machines out the crater. Impact and explosion craters, by contrast, tend to have a bowl shape. Instead of being lifted from the surface, excavated material undergoes shock displacement, shattering and flowing in a manner similar to that of a fluid for the duration of the shock. Another common feature of electrically generated craters, Thornhill explains, is terracing along the sides, sometimes corkscrewing down to the floor following the rotary motion of the arc. The Moon and Mars both provide many examples of terraced and corkscrew craters. Central peaks tend to be symmetrical and steep-sided, similar to the central nipple left by plasma machining as the rotary corkscrewing motion of the arc cuts out the material around it. Thornhill contrasts this with irregular mass of the so-called rebound peak in a lab-produced impact or explosion crater. In a number of craters on the Moon, the central peak connects to the surrounding terrain within isthmus, just as in a plasma machine crater when the arc is quenched before completing a full rotation. A telling characteristic of electrical origin, Thornhill says, is a crater centered on the rim of another crater. This is a common sight on the Moon and some planets. It's an expected effect of the arc jumping to or striking the highest elevations. Finally, many volcanoes are more likely scaled up versions of Fulgamites, Thornhill explains. Fulgamites are blisters of material raised on lightning arresters during a strike. Typically, a fulgamite has a deep fluted outer edge and a crater at the top, formed as the more diffuse discharge that raised the fulgamite pinches down to a narrow arc. The more impressive example is Olympus Mons on Mars, 600 kilometers across and 24 kilometers high. A six-stroke crater was machined into the top as the arc narrowed and jumped to high spots on each successive rim. Okay, we're in the home stretch. Last 2.5 pages. The lightning-scarred God. The possibility that human memories could explain some of the great surprises of the space age does not come as a surprise to Talbot. As an example, he describes the ancient scar face motif. A theme that occurs in many cultures is that of the warrior god who, at a time of upheaval, receives a gaping wound or scar on his forehead, face, or thigh. At first sight, this is hardly surprising because warriors and wounds do go together. However, this is not the story just of a warrior, but of the celestial archetype of warriors, the god whom human warriors celebrated as their inspiration on the battlefield. In early astronomies, this warrior archetype is identified with the specific planet, Mars. It was said of the Greek Mars, named Ares, that this celestial warrior received a deep gash as in his encounter with Diomedes. Then the god lets loose the howl of 1,000 warriors and rushes to Zeus to bemoan his gaping wound. An alternative Greek name for Mars was Heracles, and this god too suffered a harsh wound in his thigh. The Blackfoot Indians do not appear to have preserved any astronomical associations with their legendary warrior Scarface, nor do the Aztecs appear to have remembered any planetary connections for their famous scarred god, Tlaloc. But Talbot insists that a comparative approach can demonstrate the common roots of such mythical themes. Is it possible, then, that the wounding of Mars refers to an actual event? Quote, I remember looking at one of the first Mariner photographs of Mars, Talbot recalls. It displayed a stupendous chasm cutting across the face of the planet. Even from a considerable distance, the chasm looked like a scar. End quote. Astronomers christened it Valles Marineris. Its size was such that it would swallow 1,000 Grand Canyons and more. Quote, at that moment, I realized that of all the planets and moons in our solar system, Mars alone bore the likeness of the warrior god's wound. End quote. This comparative method can also account for numerous details that the experts have missed. Most dramatic is the connection between the Scarface theme and the lightning of the gods. Talbot gives as an example the god Enceladus, struck down by a thunderbolt of Zeus. The god was remembered as the lightning-scarred god. Enceladus appears to be a counterpart of the monster Typhon, the thunderstruck god. Both can be identified as the terrible aspect of the celestial warrior, according to Talbot, for it was in his man-slaying rampage that Ares received the wound. Talbot was the first to connect the highly visible scarring of the Aztec Tlaloc to lightning. Quote, that's entirely due to the fact that the experts have not looked at the worldwide theme, he says. Tlaloc was, in fact, directly linked to lightning, and it was through lightning that he dispatched souls to the Aztec heaven. In Aztec mythology, there is a special afterlife world reserved for people who are killed by lightning. It is ruled by Tlaloc and is called Tlalocan. Quote, could something as massive as Valles Marineris, have been carved by interplanetary lightning? End quote. Talbot wondered, as it turned out he had the opportunity to pose that very question to Wallace Thornhill. The lightning-scarred planet. Thornhill and Talbot met nearly a decade after the first images of Valles Marineris were returned. Talbot summarized his investigations of the lightning-scarred god theme. Could Valles Marineris have been caused by a thunderbolt, he asked. Thornhill replied, it couldn't have been anything else. Last page. At 4,000 kilometers long, 700 kilometers across in places, and up to 6 kilometers deep, it's comparable to scaling up the Grand Canyon to stretch from New York to Los Angeles. Approximately 2 million cubic kilometers of the Martian surface were moved with no comparable debris field apparent. Valles Marineris, quote, Valles Marineris was created within minutes by a giant electric arc sweeping across the surface of Mars, Thornhill claims. The rock and soil were lifted into space. Some of it fell back around the planet to create the great strewn fields of boulders seen by both Viking landers and Pathfinder, end quote. He points to the steep, scalloped walls of the canyon and the central ridges as typical of plasma machining. The side gullies often terminate in circular alcoves and are left hanging with no debris apron in the main channel. They tend to join at right angles. Smaller channels and crater chains run parallel to the main channels. Quote, the arc probably began in the east in the region of chaotic terrain, Thornhill speculates. It then swept westward, forming the great parallel canyons. It finally terminated in the huge rilles of Noctis Labyrinthus, end quote. Thornhill has published a CD entitled The Electric Universe, which describes these and other electrical phenomena as on an astronomical scale. He cites the research of Talbot that demonstrates the ancient peoples witnessed an age when these now quiescent energies were dominant. All the planets associated with the deities of myth are covered with scars that are best explained as plasma discharge features. The craters, volcanoes, and canyons, when examined in detail, show essential differences from terrestrial counterparts, yet those anomalous features do correspond with the features of lightning scars. Talbot's prediction that the reconstructed themes of myth should be verified in massive physical evidence on the planets gains support with every image returned by space probes. Valles Marineris bears the most striking correspondence with the mythical warrior god's wound. This mighty chasm represents the confluence of two worldviews, the dramatic historical view of mythology and the objective physical worldview of science. If Talbot and Thornhill are correct, the accepted understanding of both myth and science must be rebuilt on a new foundation that will support both the historical past and the electrical future. The end. Sometimes it becomes a slog towards the end of that second article. But that is the end of section 2 in this book. That is all there is on the gradualism and catastrophism section, making the case for catastrophism. So part 3 gets us into exploring the greater antiquity of civilization, starting off with the enigma of India's origins, followed by pushing back the portals of civilization. Evidence of advanced prehistoric civilization is bearing new fruit. And that one's actually written by the editor of these books. So, all right. That's the 2 that we will read next week. So come on back. Hopefully we'll be on time. We should be starting at 9:30. And theoretically, I can start a little earlier if people would prefer that. But we'll keep it at 9:30 until people say otherwise. And if you have any ideas for further research, or this gave you ideas on other books you want me to read and bring into the discussion, say so in the chat, or as these videos go up on YouTube, you can leave it in the comments section there. Also, I know a lot of you may not be interested, but part of why I'm doing this is not just for my own knowledge, but I also happen to be involved in tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm using it sort of as some inspiration for my gaming, for world building. So if you have any ideas like that, I hope you took something away. If you want to share it, great. Again, chat or comments. And we'll see you next week. I'm going to take a quick break, and then I will come back for my next session of gaming, playing Fallout 3. See you in a little bit.